Dr. John Kaye.
I rise to enthusiastically support the motion of my colleague Kate Fairman, and I believe that this is an important statement of this parliament as a proportionally elected representatives of the people of New South Wales, that we stand firmly for equality wherever it occurs. Mr. President, I begin by quoting from a letter that was sent to me by Peter and Evelyn Gray about a month ago, and a letter which I must say I found extremely moving. And I wish to quote extensively from that letter simply because we can create all sorts of human rights arguments and moral arguments and political arguments about what's happening here, but in the end what we are doing is we are talking about people and what happens in people's lives and how those lives are transformed by their sexuality, and in particular by the way our society responds to sexuality. And I must say, but I can't actually put this into good words, but the reality is the top of this letter has a photo of two really gorgeous young women, really very, very beautiful young women. And Peter and Evelyn write to us and say, "We have been married for over 38 years and we have raised two daughters, one an accountant and the other a human rights lawyer. When they were children, we often talked with them about their futures, what careers they aspired to, and about the possibility of falling in love and getting married. Subsequently, both daughters did fall in love, but only one has been able to marry her partner. Our straight daughter, pictured above on her wedding day with her sister, married her husband 3 years ago in a non-religious civil ceremony presided over by a civil marriage celebrant. Our gay daughter clearly wishes to marry the love of her life, but cannot marry in Australia because of the inequality enshrined in the Marriage Act. We sincerely hope that the marriage equality will soon become a reality so that she can be afforded the same right as her sister, the right to celebrate their love and commitment in a civil ceremony in front of family and friends." Mr. President, Evelyn and Peter are now joined by the President of the United States, Barack Obama, in that desire. They're joined by 57% of the Australian population who were prepared to tell the Nielsen poll that they stood firmly for equality of access to the institution of marriage. And they are joined by a growing movement of public figures, of elected people, and even members of religions Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Peter and Evelyn are joined by a growing movement of public figures, by even people who hold senior ranks within churches, and by politicians who say this. They say that love is love. They say it should be honoured and it should be respected. They say that society has no reason to discriminate about love because of the gender of the individuals involved within it. Mr. President, this is 2012. And we have moved beyond fear. We've moved beyond the irrationality of saying that what other people do is a matter for us to judge, and we have moved beyond bigotry. In the past 500 years, we have won great victories. We have won a victory over slavery. We have won the emancipation of women. We have won a universal acceptance of respect for people with disabilities. We have ceased to discriminate against people because they are left-handed, and we have moved to a common understanding that racism is not cool. And we have made great strides in understanding that people's sexuality is their business. It should be respected regardless of what the nature of that sexuality is. We have an understanding now that comes from the age of enlightenment and has been refined and strengthened through decades, through centuries of debate about what humanity means. We have an understanding that human rights are universal and absolute and exist regardless of the sexual preferences of an individual. Mr. President, what is essential to understand here is that this motion before the House today is part of a national and a global movement that says that sexuality should be respected. Sexuality should be understood, it should be celebrated, but it should not be discriminated against. We have moved well and truly beyond the day where we illegalised, where we discriminated against and where we ridiculed people because of the choice of the gender of their sexual partner.
Order. The level of noise is again on both sides of the chamber rising to a level where it's difficult to hear the speaker. Order! I would be grateful if members could resume their seats, and if conversations need to take place, that they should be inaudible. The Honourable Dr. John Kaye.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will not go through the arguments against same-sex marriage put forward by the opponents of this marriage in any great detail, largely because I think they are all easily dismissed. But I will say this: marriage is not about procreation. If it were purely about procreation, about the production of offspring, then we would not allow people to get married once they had moved beyond their reproductive years. We would not allow people to get married who could not have children. Are the opponents of this motion seriously saying that what we should do is test everybody for their fertility before we allow them to get married? Obviously not. It is a nonsense to say that marriage is purely about procreation. Marriage is about a public celebration of a love between two individuals and a commitment between those two individuals which is welcomed and celebrated by their friends, their family and by society in general. There is nothing in that that says that the potential to produce children is an essential ingredient of that marriage. And in any event, Mr. President, as we would know, there are many same-sex couples who one of whom has a child or does not have a child, but they adopt a child and they raise that child, and they do so extremely well. Anecdotally, I have a large number of young friends, very young friends, who are being raised in same-sex relationships and who are, I must say, thriving in the love of two parents. The love of two parents that I find indistinguishable from the love of the parents in relationships which are of opposite sexes. Mr. President, there is absolutely no evidence to say that those children who are raised in same-sex relationships are in any way disadvantaged by the gender of their parents. There is no evidence. The evidence, whatever so-called studies support that, can be traced back to an ideological desire or a so-called moral desire to undermine the argument for same-sex marriage. The reality, Mr. President, is that there is some damage done to children of same-sex marriage, and that damage is done by those who seek to discriminate on the basis of the genders of their parents. If there is a genuine
order, I am sorry, Doc. The level of conversation is very high. I don't want to have to call people to order during a debate like this, but I will if it continues. Dr. John Kaye.
Thank you, Mr. President. Every member of this chamber comes in here with a burning desire to protect children from damage. And in that case, those who are serious about it should overcome their other concerns and understand that there are children in same-sex marriages, and one of the key in same-sex relationships, and one of the key ingredients of protecting those children is moving society to a non-discriminatory basis. In that case, supporting this motion, supporting the idea that love is equal and that partners who have equal love should be respected, is an important step towards protecting children. Mr. President, the history of an institution should not bind its future. If it were true that because an institution had had a certain characteristic throughout all of history, therefore we should not change it, then we would still have slavery. We would still have relationships between people which were slavery. We would still have relationships between people which were bound to the idea that a woman was inferior to a man. We have moved beyond that. Institutions serve the society in which they are situated. The institution of marriage, like every other institution, needs to adjust and adopt to the values and the practices of that society. We are in a society, and every day of my life, I thank the fact that I am born now, and I am born into a society where we no longer discriminate in most matters against people at least officially, against people who are same-sex attracted, people who are gay and lesbian, bisexual and intersex. Mr. President, the institution of marriage needs to evolve. It is not good enough to say marriage by definition is between a man and a woman. because if that were so, then the definition would be inadequate. The definition fails to reflect where our society has gone and what has become and our understanding of human rights. Mr. President, I finish on the issues of arguments against the motion before the House with the following. It has been said that recognising same-sex marriages will undermine the institution of opposite-sex marriage. That fear is completely unfounded. It is not only unfounded, but in fact it is self-defeating. The only damage being done to the institution of marriage is those who seek to selfishly confine it purely to those of opposite sex. It is those individuals...
Order. I call the Honourable Marie Ficarra to order for the first time.
It is those individuals, Mr. President, who in their selfish attempt to exclude gays and lesbians who are doing the real damage to the institution of marriage by bringing it into disrepute, by making people, and we saw this with the contribution of the government whip. The government whip indeed said that in fact what one should probably do is privatise the whole institution and abolish the Marriage Act in order to overcome the concerns of those who are opposed to this marriage. In fact, what this debate has done by the nature of the opposition to it is raise the whole question of the basis of marriage. In fact, it's a whip thing, I think. The opposition whip also raised her dislike of marriage as an institution. I would advise those, and I don't count myself amongst it, who are deeply committed to the institution of marriage to in fact drop their opposition to this, to welcome warmly more people into that institution in order to strengthen it, rather than acting in a selfish and exclusionary way, precluding people and degrading the institution, the very institution they seek to support. Mr. President, overwhelmingly, what this motion does is it says to people, if you do not like same-sex marriage, then for goodness sake, do not involve yourself in it. There is nothing in this motion or in anything anybody has said that is making same-sex marriage compulsory. And I think I would probably oppose any motion that did. This motion is purely about... Yes, I would, actually, but that's another debate. Bring it on. Let's have that debate, Melinda. Mr. President, this motion is not about changing what people do against their will. This motion is not about forcing people into same-sex marriage. It is about the generosity of spirit that makes a great society, that extends the warm hand to everybody within it and says all institutions are open to you because you have human rights and you are a valued member of our society. I want to conclude my presentation, Mr. President, by quoting from an article by Annabel Crabb in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 13th of May 2012. And I tried to say this myself, but in the end I thought Ms Crabb had said it more eloquently than I could possibly. She says this: "At heart, it's a confronting but simple question. Could you look at your neighbour or your workmate or your sister or, in the fullness of time, at your child and tell them with your recognition that your recognition of their love and commitment will depend on the equipment of the person they have chosen?" She concludes by saying, and I conclude by saying, here's a better question. Are we so overburdened with happiness in this world that we can knock back a small percentage of the population who are keen to generate extra supplies of it by pledging themselves to each other? It is a simple question, really, and is a question to which every member of this House should say overwhelmingly, we are not prepared, we are not so overburdened. We welcome all people into the institution of marriage.
Order.